You arrive in a dusty little town carved out of the endless plains of the American West. The wooden signs creak in the wind. The streets are little more than ruts in the earth, and every other building is either a saloon or a church, sometimes both, depending on the hour. May didn't swan around in velvet gowns most days. She spent her mornings accounting, bartering for firewood, chasing off drunkards who hadn't paid, and patching up broken doors or splintered tables after yet another brawl the night before. A madame was part landlord, part mother, part enforcer, and part accountant. She needed all three. One night, a minor high on laudanum tried to take one of her girls without paying. One competitor paid a group of drunken cowboys to start a fight in May's parlor, hoping the law would shut her down. Nights when the loneliness felt worse than the dust storms. She knew too much to trust anyone. No real friends, no lovers she could keep. Her life was measured in ledgers and lies. May responded by having her girls serve free drinks for a week, luring away every last customer from her enemy. May put buckshot in the ceiling just inches from his ear. He paid in full and left town the next day. This is where you'll meet her. The madam, a woman as infamous as any gunslinger, but far less likely to be remembered in history books. Her name was May Delaney, or at least that's what she called herself. Did May Delaney want to be a madam, or was that simply what was left to her? Most madams didn't use real names. The less the law knew, the better. Sheriffs and deputies knew that if they wanted to find out what was really happening in town, who was planning to rob the stagecoach, who was cheating at poker, and quietly paid the doctor's fee for anyone who couldn't afford it. The town never thanked her, but they knew who had a bounty on their head. May would know. She had ears in every booth, every room, but that knowledge came with a price. She could never let her guard down. May ran one of the most respectable establishments in Tombstone, Arizona, if such a word could even be applied. Her girls were clean. Her whiskey was stronger than her competition's, and her rules were ironclad. No fighting, no cheating the girls, no touching without consent, and most importantly, no debt. Running a saloon brothel wasn't glamorous, even if dime novels painted it that way. But it wasn't the violence or the labor that made her life brutal. It was the invisibility. Men came and went. Women took. The town might hail her one day and call for her arrest the next. Morality was a moving target. On Sunday, her neighbors took communion. On Monday, they'd slip through the back door after curfew and try to haggle a discount. Her girls, meanwhile, were mostly survivors. Some had fled abusive husbands. Others had come west, hoping for land or husbands of their own, only to end up broke and alone. Working under May meant protection. She took 50%, which was steep, but she kept them safe. That was more than most madams could claim. The law, such as it was, saw her as a useful evil. She kept a Derringer pistol hidden in her corset, a stiletto blade in her boot, and a double-barrel shotgun under the bar. Still, danger wasn't just from strangers. Rival madams could be just as brutal. Slander, threats, even sabotage. But there were nights May cried. And yet, she endured. She became one of the richest people in town. She paid for the first schoolhouse, donated to the local church. And you can't help but wonder, did she ever wish she'd de-chosen something else? If you walked into May Delaney's establishment at high noon, it looked more like a restaurant than a saloon. The sunlight filtered through the warped glass windows, pooling softly on polished floorboards and faded lace curtains. Girls in modest dresses swept white tables and scrubbed the wooden bar with lemon and soda at. The scent of boiling coffee and tobacco hung in the air, punctuated occasionally by the sulphurous stench of spilled whiskey from the night before. But this gentle calm was only the eye of the storm. May ran the brothel as if it were a military post. Chores were assigned by rotation. Rooms had to be aired out, sheets washed, and not just for hygiene, but reputation. Cleanliness was one of her key selling points, and affection, only to publicly condemn immorality from the pulpit each Sunday. Her hands were no longer smooth, calloused from wringing sheets and lifting barrels. Reformists from the East, armed with pamphlets and May would invite them in for tea, listen politely, and smile like a hostess at a funeral. She knew they'd leave within a week. Dusty, disappointed, and no closer to saving anyone. Still, she wore rouge, curled her hair, and dressed to command a room. She wasn't trying to look young. She was trying to look dangerous, and it worked. She lost girls, some to disease, others to drink, and some who simply vanished between towns, never to be heard from again. She once served shots in a soot-streaked barroom the day after the fire, wearing a scarf over her mouth and a rifle across her lap. Every loss left her a little colder. She stopped learning their real names, but no one could deny she held her power well. Or finally, disappear into the hills. She started calling everyone darling instead of remembering individual backstories. May didn't flinch. She knew hypocrisy was a pillar of civilization out here. She even had a saying for it. Everyone's got two faces out west. One for God, one for survival. She also kept a ledger of whispers, a coded notebook full of observations, overheard confessions, and secrets traded in moments of weakness. She taught her girls how to speak without slurring, how to carry themselves at the piano, how to serve a drink with both elegance and distance. That she'd been married once to a sheriff who beat her senseless until she shot him in the thigh and disappeared into the desert, not out of vice or ambition, but necessity, because no one else would hire them, because they were too smart to work the laundry line and too tough to beg. No one ever asked her to confirm it. In towns like Tombstone or Deadwood, silence was a kind of currency. The girl who fell in love with a customer, a traveling card sharp who promised her marriage and escaped to Denver. He disappeared with her savings the night before they were to elope. May didn't say, "I told you so." Every night, May looked into it and studied her reflection. It was like watching herself age in reverse, her old self fading further away with each passing year. She used to be a seamstress, born in St. Louis, raised by a German immigrant mother who taught her lacework and bookkeeping. That woman was gone now, left behind with the riverboats and corseted dreams. She just held the sobbing girl, gave her a few days off, and moved on. She drilled them on who each customer was, what they liked, and what subjects to avoid. One could argue she ran a school as much as a saloon. She believed intelligence sold just as well as looks. It was her insurance policy. If any sheriff or local judge dared cross her, she could destroy their career with 2 pages of information. She once fired a girl who refused to wash after each client, saying, "If you won't respect yourself, no one else will." May's day was broken into rituals. Mornings were for business, suppliers, orders, mending broken chairs, counting. By afternoon, May turned her attention to grooming. Not just physical, but social. Still, no matter how well-oiled the operation, there were always problems. There was Lucille, then there was the matter of the preacher's son, who frequented the establishment every week, demanding privacy. Her own face had changed too. Years of cigarette smoke and sleepless nights carved lines around her eyes. Sometimes, federal agents came poking around. Prohibitionists, women's temperance types. The West didn't need saving. It needed structure. It needed women like her, who could enforce rules when the law looked the other way. Behind her bar was a mirror, cracked in one corner, clouded at the edges. There were rumors, of course, that May had killed a man in Kansas City. What is often forgotten in stories of the Wild West is how many women like May built their own queendoms in the shadows. May's success didn't protect her from sorrow, though still, she never closed. Not once. Through cholera outbreaks, economic crashes, even the Great Fire that swept through the main street, May's saloon stayed open. She was called a sinner, a saint, a tyrant, and a mother. Sometimes all in the same day. And yet, if the world around her collapsed tomorrow, if the saloon burned again, or the law turned for real, what would she do? Would May Delaney rebuild one more time? The end of the line came not with a gunfight, nor with a mob of moral crusaders, but with a railroad. It always seemed to end that way in the West. Not with bullets, but with iron and steam. May Delaney watched the tracks extend toward Tombstone, like veins carrying something bigger, faster, and more dangerous than Outlaw's progress. With the railroad came new settlers, investors, banks, and churches with permanent pews. People began to speak about cleaning up the town, not in hushed whispers, but openly, boldly, as if the saloons and gambling dens had never been the reason the town survived in the first place. She felt it in her bones. The change. Even the air smelled different, more like coal smoke and store-bought perfume than whiskey and unwashed denim. More families arrived with baby carriages and lace umbrellas. More women in high collars who turned their heads when they passed her windows. The mayor no longer asked for her donations to the schoolhouse fund. The sheriff began making small talk with the new banker's wife, instead of tipping his hat to her. And the worst part, business slowed. Not all at once. She poured herself a shot of her finest rye and toasted the cracked mirror. At first, it was just quieter on Mondays. Then, fewer soldiers from the nearby fort. Then a few of her girls packed their bags. Maybe she hoped something would turn, that the railroad would change its mind, that the town would realize what it had lost. But it didn't, and left for Prescott or Phoenix, hoping the boom was shifting. May didn't blame him. For a time, it worked. Curiosity drew in the newcomers. But curiosity fades fast when social reputation is on the line. The girls are free, and I was never your villain. You can only serve tea in a brothel for so long before someone starts asking what S in the back rooms. She even gave them a week's earnings as a gift. The piano remained silent. The mirror stayed cracked. Dust gathered on the empty shelves like a second skin. The kind with bulk flour sacks, bolts of gingham fabric, and a friendly sign that said, "Family values first." Others claim she went into the mountains to join a mining outfit, or perhaps opened another saloon under a different name in Colorado. A few romantics say she married a rancher and lived quietly until old age, finally at peace. Still, she stayed. She always stayed. She tried to adapt to her lighting. More music, and even added a small stage where one of her girls sang parlor ballads and played rap. She was something in between a survivor, an entrepreneur, a woman who built an empire out of broken furniture and broken dreams. She didn't belong to history books, but to whispers, and the stories that only come out after the sun goes down. Not in church, not in the paper, not in school books. The new sheriff, a stiff man, with a law degree from Chicago and a handshake like a limp fish, made it clear. May's time was up. Everyone knew what it meant. No charges, no raids, just an ordinance, passed quietly, limiting the hours of saloons and outlawing female companionship for commercial purposes. It was the legal equivalent of eviction by starvation. Within a month, May's place was nearly empty. Her most loyal patrons left first, not because they turned their backs, but because they didn't want to bring her trouble. She didn't fight it. She didn't make a scene. May simply shuttered the upstairs rooms, locked the parlor doors, and sat behind the bar in silence. 4 weeks. She did little but sweep and wait. What's left when the world no longer needs you? One afternoon, May packed a small carpet bag with her ledgers, her pistol, her best boots, and a hand-stitched velvet dress. She left a note on the bar. To whoever finds this, the debts are cleared. Then she walked out the back door. Just like that. Some say she caught a stagecoach heading south toward the Mexican border. But the truth, no one knows. The building stood empty for years. Some tried to reopen it, but none could match the old magic. Eventually, the building was torn down and replaced by a dry goods store. They never mentioned May, but every now and then, an old-timer would glance at the spot and say, "That used to be hers." No need to say more. May Delaney wasn't a hero. She wasn't a villain either, and you wonder, was she glad to vanish? Or did she hope that, in some forgotten archive or saloon ghost story, someone might remember her? If you found yourself in a bustling mining town in the American West during the 1860s or 1870s, chances are you'd notice the noise first. Clanging picks, braying donkeys, and the constant murmur of deals being made or broken. But if you rose early, just before the sun peeked over the and followed the scent of lye, soap, and steam, you'd find another world entirely. One of suds, water barrels, blistered fingers, and washboards. While many might assume laundresses were wives or widows trying to earn a few cents, in many towns, the backbone of the laundry trade was Chinese immigrants, especially Chinese men. So, they turned to the one business no one else wanted: laundry. In towns like Virginia City or Deadwood, white women might have run small washing operations out of their homes. Still, the large-scale laundry services that kept prospectors, gamblers, barkeeps, and sheriffs in clean shirts were often staffed entirely by Chinese workers. The kind of smell that clung to everything: your skin, your bedding, even your food. In dry climates, the desert sun might bake clothes crisp in hours, but during winter or in mountain towns, drying took all day, sometimes longer. Most miners had two shirts. One they wore and one they washed. If they could afford it, others simply went until the stench became unbearable. Laundries competed for business by offering quick turnarounds, even promising next-day returns. Though this was rarely realistic during snow or storms, lines were strung between posts, trees, or makeshift racks. Shirts flapped like flags, and heaven help you if the wind knocked the customer's only pair of trousers into the dirt. She washed over 40 pounds of clothes per day, 6 days a week. From a tiny shack beside the river, she worked alone, refused credit, and never let anyone inside her washing shack. The steam from boiling water soaked into every inch of her clothes, her skin. She never quite felt dry, but she kept going, day after day, because when the miners washed up and came into town in crisp collars, when the saloon girls twirled and laundered petticoats, it was Alice's invisible labor that made it possible. It was her domain, her rules, and in a world where women were often beholden to men for food or shelter, that mattered. She kept 2 goats, a bucket for heating water, and a dog named Rufus, who slept on a pile of burlap sacks. She charged 10 cents per item and kept a running list nailed to the inside of her door. Mr. Jacob's 3 shirts, 2 drawers, 1 handkerchief, unpaid. Laundry day wasn't just a domestic task. In a boomtown, it was an industrial operation. A single shirt might cost 25 cents to wash, a decent profit, except that it came at the cost of hours of labor. Washers had to pay for soap ingredients, firewood, water rights, and sometimes even protection fees to local enforcers or corrupt officials. Widows, abandoned wives, and women who didn't want to work in saloons or boarding houses often turned to washing as their main trade. For them, it was a lifeline, a way to maintain independence without entering more dangerous lines of work. The people who handled it weren't always who you'd expect. Fights broke out, rocks were thrown. More than one laundry was burned to the ground in anti-immigrant riots. And yet, the laundries reopened. They had to. There was no other way to survive. These were men who had fled famine and political unrest in Guangdong province, crossing an ocean and then a continent, only to find themselves excluded from mining claims and railroad contracts. It was backbreaking work. Before sunup, the laundresses and launderess would fetch water, sometimes from creeks a quarter-mile away. Clothes were scrubbed on metal washboards, beaten against flat stones, or twisted until dirt, oil, and sweat came loose. There were no machines, no shortcuts. Every shirt was an arm workout. Every pair of socks, a potential blister. Buckets were carried by hand or loaded onto yokes slung across narrow shoulders. The water was poured into iron cauldrons or tin washtubs and heated over open fires. There were no thermostats. Only a practiced hand knew when the water was hot enough to scald, but not too hot to destroy a wool shirt. Lye soap, often made by hand from animal fat and wood ash, was rubbed into collars and cuffs until hands bled, and the smell, it was equal parts soap, sweat, and smoke. Not unpleasant, exactly, but dense. Drying wasn't simple either. Laundry day wasn't once a week, either. In towns with hundreds of single men, laundry was a constant stream. The economics of the trade were surprisingly brutal. Disputes were common. Some white settlers accused Chinese laundries of undercutting prices. Others claimed they stole clothes, though more often it was the townspeople who failed to pay. But not all laundry workers were men. Take someone like Alice McCready, a real woman known to the census records of Idaho Territory. For women like Alice, laundry wasn't just labor. It was survival with dignity. Still, it wasn't glamorous. Wrinkled hands, burned arms, sore backs. And yet, did anyone remember who cleaned their sheets? Or did the entire town simply pretend laundry washed itself? You wouldn't think something as basic as a clothesline could spark a fight, but in the crowded maze of shanties, canvas tents, and ramshackle cabins that formed the heart of most 19th century boom, everything was contested, including space to dry laundry. Laundry workers had to compete for airflow like gamblers at a poker table. It was common to see crisscrossing lines strung from every available post, between fence rails, telegraph poles, bunkhouse porches, and even saloon balconies. Soaps had subtle scents, unique to each worker lavender. For some, tallow and ash. For others, clothes were often unmarked, and many miners owned the same few mass-produced garments: red flannel shirts, wool trousers, and cotton drawers. Laundresses had to memorize their customers' clothing quirks. A patch here, a missing button there, a frayed collar, or a stitched name inside a waistband. It wasn't just helpful, it was necessary. Returning the wrong shirt could mean a shouting match, or worse, many did. A woman named Stovepipe, Jen, so nicknamed for the ever-smoking chimney above her wash house in Deadwood, began offering pressed handkerchiefs and scented sachets for an extra fee. She sewed scraps into quilt squares and sold blankets to traveling families. Others took in mending, work replacing buttons, sewing, patches, even embroidering initials for the fancier clientele. And few had the money or time to recover. There was no paid sick leave in the West. If you didn't wash clothes, you didn't eat. No festivals, no monuments. You could identify who did the laundry just by sniffing a clean shirt. It was a strange badge of pride. The boom towns thrived on chaos, but they only functioned because someone cleaned the blood, sweat, and soot out of the cloth that clothed its citizens. They pooled resources, operated cooperatively, and often rotated labor to avoid burnout. The streets buzzed with drunken laughter and piano tunes, but her world was still. She'd watch the stars rise above the mountains, wondering if this was all she'd ever buy a washer of other people's dirt. In San Francisco, Chinese laundry guilds formed the precursors to labor, unions offering mutual aid and protection against discriminatory laws. Similar efforts sprang up in smaller towns, though they remained informal and underground. These were returned promptly, and often with a quiet nod of gratitude. But the biggest danger wasn't theft, it was disease. Sudden freezes meant half-dry clothes froze stiff as boards. You could knock on a shirt like a door, and it wouldn't get. Coyotes, and sometimes stray dogs, pulled garments from lines and dragged them into the scrub. Windstorms tore linens off and deposited them halfway across town. In towns like Bodie, Leadville, or Bannack, open ground was rare, and a sunny corner was worth almost as much as a good mining claim. A man doesn't do laundry, they'd say, or worse, are you going to wear a dress next? Chinese launderers especially bore the brunt of this cruelty. Their work was essential, yet it made them targets of racist slurs, humiliation, and physical violence. He worked alone for over 20 years, never missed a delivery, and kept meticulous handwritten records in both Cantonese and English. It's said he knew more about the town's dirty secrets than any sheriff. Yet when he died, the town paper gave him 2 lines. No obituary, no funeral. Typhoid, smallpox, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis clung to fabric long after a person fell ill. Washing a sick miner's bedding was like playing with fire. Some laundresses wore vinegar-soaked claws over their mouths accrued, a common attempt at disinfection. Others boiled suspect linens twice, then buried the ashes-soaked water far from their cabins. Imagine the absurdity. Freshly washed trousers flapping from the same railing where last night a drunkard had passed out, faced first in a bowl of chili. In this chaos, laundresses developed a silent system. Wooden clothespins were marked with initials. Then came the sorting. Occasionally, small tokens were found in pockets of toothpick, a folded love letter, or a nugget of gold. The laundry trade was one of the first lines of contact when epidemics swept through towns. Even so, they got sick. Some more entrepreneurial laundresses found ways to increase profits without increasing danger. Of course, there were setbacks too. And then there were the men not customers, but the ones who mocked the work. Despite this, many Chinese laundrymen created tight-knit communities. One Chinese launderer, remembered only by his anglicized nickname, Henry Laundry, became a local legend in Butte, Montana. There was no holiday for laundry workers, but without them, the West would have reeked literally and metaphorically. At night, after a day spent scrubbing and boiling and wringing, a laundress might sit outside her door with a tin cup of coffee, her hands raw and bandaged, her arms aching. And yet, was it really just laundry if it held a town together? As boomtowns evolved into cities or vanished back into dust, the role of the laundress slowly faded into the background of historical memory. Yet, in the final decades of the 19th century, laundry work remained one of the few semi-stable professions in the American West that was open to women and immigrants alike. Some of these were about safety, open fires, cauldrons, and flammable wooden structures made for a dangerous mix, especially in dry climates. But others were clearly aimed at pushing certain people out, especially Chinese launderers. A few laundresses even began taking on apprentices, younger women or teenage boys who wanted to learn the trade. It was a strange form of legacy building, passed not through schools or formal training, but from blistered hands to eager ones. New laws in towns like San Francisco required laundries to be located in brick buildings or to obtain permits that were nearly impossible to get. One woman in Helena, Montana, is said to have invested her laundry earnings into a saloon, then a boarding house, then a stake in a silver claim. The independent laundress, the woman with the washboard and cauldron, found herself edged out by factories with steam-powered rollers and laborers on hourly wages. By the time she died, she owned more land than the mayor. A few, fiercely independent, refused to yield and continued hand-washing well into the 20th century, serving loyal customers who swore no machine could match their skill. The women and men who had built boomtown economies on their backs were no longer the backbone. If all of those bore invisible fingerprints, was it really such a small story after all? There were shadows in the background. Their work taken for granted once more. Her name is lost to history, buried in probate records and forgotten street maps. But for a while, she was a queen made not of velvet and lace, but soap and steam, not on monuments or gravestones, but in the way towns survived long enough to become cities. In the photographs of cleanly dressed miners, polished soldiers, and children in white Sunday, in the steam that once rose from every corner of the mining West, fragrant with soap and woods. The message was clear. Your work is needed, but your presence is not. It straddled the line between respectability and hardship, invisibility and necessity. By the 1880s, many towns began implementing formal regulations around laundry businesses, fire ordinances, licensing fees, and inspections. And yet, even amid rising discrimination, laundries persisted. They adapted. Some added ironing services, others expanded into dyeing, tailoring, or soap making. These were little more than tents, with a stove, buckets, and a strong back. They disappeared just as fast when the mines dried up. But for those few months, there were gold mines in their own right, if not in ore, then in sweat and coin, in the high altitude towns of Colorado and Utah, where snowfall blanketed streets well into April. Laundresses rigged up indoor drying lines, using pulley systems across cabin ceilings. One clever woman in Telluride built a small greenhouse-like structure, using old window frames to create a solar drying station. Her laundry never froze, and her business thrived through the winter. In mining camps that swelled during gold strikes, temporary pop-up laundries emerged. There were even stories, mostly whispered, of laundresses who struck it rich. Then came the machines. With the arrival of industrial laundries in larger cities and the introduction of wringer washers and commercial presses, the nature of laundry work began to shift. Some adapted, finding work in the new laundries. Others faded into retirement, worn down by decades of physical labor. But by the early 1900s, laundry work was largely invisible. Again this time, swallowed not by necessity, but by and you wondered if every shirt buttoned clean for a wedding, every sheet laid crisp in a boarding house, every handkerchief offered in a moment of grief. Who truly kept the West civilized, the men who struck gold, or the ones who scrubbed their socks? The California gold rush is often painted in strokes of rugged masculinity, pickaxes, beards, and muddy boots. But tucked between these broad brushstrokes is a quieter, more cunning history. That of the women who moved gold, not with brute strength, but with ingenuity. They didn't mine the gold, they smuggled it. Within a year, over 80,000 people had flooded into California, hoping to strike it rich. The gold fields quickly became a male-dominated wilderness. Towns like Coloma, Hangtown, and Nevada City sprouted overnight, but they were chaotic, lawless, and poorly organized. There were few banks, even fewer secure storage options, and almost no law enforcement in those early years. Theft was rampant. If a miner struck gold, his real challenge wasn't digging it out yet. Clever smugglers added hidden panels to the inner layers, stuffing them with flannel-wrapped nuggets. Some even sewed gold into the hems of practice, so common that later frontier gossip included phrases like, "She walks with a fortune in her hand," which she sold to prospectors, and then reclaimed unsold inventory. After it had passed through checkpoints, others soaked gold dust into wax or tallow, forming it into candles or soap bars. The structure of the corset concealed weight. A woman could carry several ounces of gold worth hundreds of dollars without drawing suspicion. If asked, she might feign frailty, blaming her slow gait on female troubles. She started by offering to men miners shirts which conveniently came with loose seams, already filled with flakes. They shared tips, safe routes, trusted buyers, and which roads to avoid. Gold was considered taxable property, and smuggling it, especially across territorial lines, could result in fines, confiscation, or worse. Some women were stripped and searched publicly, others jailed. The humiliation was often worse than the legal consequences. These weren't criminal rings. They were survival coalitions, women helping women in a world where banks were scarce. Laws were unevenly applied, and violence was a constant threat. She then partnered with a local carpenter who built her a sewing chest with a false bottom. If you could move gold without being noticed, you controlled its destiny. When authorities finally caught her, she was found to be transporting over $5,000 in concealed gold, equivalent to more than $175,000 today. Highwaymen roamed the roads. Some towns had corrupt local officials who confiscated suspicious gold for investigation, rarely to be seen again. And there were taxes. Territorial governments, desperate for revenue, tried to impose duties on exported gold. Many miners refused to pay. In corsets, hymns, hatpins, and even pies. Some were hired by miners for a fee. Others smuggled on behalf of family or business partners. A few, like the infamous Bell Brass Knuckles, Minton, did it for themselves, amassing small fortunes one pouch at a time. It began, like most things in the West, with scarcity. They didn't pan for gold themselves, at least not in large numbers, but they observed. They listened, and they realized something the men didn't tee. The safest way to transport gold wasn't tea in saddlebags or pockets. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. And to the women, they were less likely to be suspected of theft, especially if they were dressed as respectable matrons or nuns. And while men often bragged about their finds, women kept quiet, tucking gold dust into seams and stitching nuggets into the lining of their bodices. Initially, there were only a few wives, widows, and women who had braved the treacherous overland journey or taken a ship around Cape Horn. Iwethanoina woman. Women could pass more freely than men through checkpoints in towns. One of the earliest smuggling methods involved corsets. These were everyday items, stiffened with whalebone or steel stays, and worn by most women regardless of class. Another favorite was the hoop skirt. These wide, bell-shaped skirts were perfect for hiding a dozen small cloth pouches tied at intervals around the frame. Some smugglers went further. In San Francisco, a woman known only as Madame R reportedly baked coins and gold flakes into thick meat pies. But why all the smuggling? Because once you had gold, getting it to a buyer safely was its own gamble. So women became couriers, carrying gold from camps to cities like Sacramento and San Francisco. Belle was a laundress by trade, but she quickly saw the value in side hustles. Some smugglers worked solo, but others formed quiet, informal networks, and they had to be careful. If caught, the penalties could be brutal. Still, they persisted. They understood something the miners didn't. Gold is heavy, but power travels light. But what did these women do with their smuggled wealth? Did they strike it rich? Did they live comfortably? Or did the weight of their hidden treasure eventually wear them down? By the mid-1850s, the female gold smugglers of California had grown more sophisticated, not only in the ways they concealed wealth, but also in how they managed, invested, and protected it. In an era when women couldn't legally own property in most states, without a husband or male guardian, the women of the gold fields learned how to operate in the margins. She began her work as a domestic servant in a boarding house, frequented by mid-tier prospectors, not the wild drunks, but the careful diggers who made steady returns. She noticed how frequently they complained about losing gold to bandits, to crooked shipping agents, or even to fellow miners. And she also noticed that they often trusted her more than their own partners. They used proxies, aliases, or silent partnerships. They didn't just move gold, they moved influence. Her reputation for honesty spread faster than gossip on a Sunday. Within a year, she was moving more gold than most freight wagons. Her secret, a double-bottomed wash basin and a bonnet reinforced with tin inserts that held pouches of dust and nuggets, all stitched beneath decorative lace. Take, for instance, the case of Margaret O'Connor, an Irish immigrant who arrived in San Francisco with barely a coin to her name. She bought a corner laton paper under the name of a widowed cousin Anne, opened a bakery that became a front for gold brokerage. She couldn't read or write well, but she hired a young clerk who handled her ledgers and gave him 10% of every transaction. She claimed illness, but when questioned, she resisted and eventually fell. A seam burst open in her dress, spilling several ounces of gold onto the dusty street. She was arrested, fined $200, and her cargo was confiscated, though the official record calls it unauthorized transport. Locals remembered it as the Great Golden Corset Incident. Women who once risked their lives ferrying gold dust in secret now owned boarding houses, mercantile shops, and even saloons. They became quiet backers of infrastructure, paying for schools, sponsoring churches, and even funding the occasional newspaper. By the time she was 35, she owned 2 properties, a general goods store, and shares in a steamer company. None of it bore her name. All of it was hers, so she made them a quiet offer. For a small fee, she would transport their gold into the city and deliver it directly to a buyer she knew. But from the hidden wealth sewn into skirts and hymns, smuggled down mountain passes in silence, Margaret reinvested her profits. A former school teacher named Lydia Miles reportedly hid gold and hollowed out volumes of Latin literature. "The perfect place," she once joked. Since no one out here reads books, she partnered with a local stagecoach driver who helped her move shipments between Placerville and Stockton. Their system ran like clockwork for over 4 years, earning enough to send Lydia back east in style, where she purchased a large boarding house under Amana's name and ran it as a quiet landlady for the rest of her life. She wasn't alone. Other women followed similar paths. Then there was Rosa Villarreal, a California woman from an old Spanish landowning family whose once prosperous holdings had been chipped away by squatters and miners after California became part of the U.S. Instead of fighting the newcomers, she joined them on her own terms. Rosa wore elegant lace mantillas and carried a rosary wherever she went, presenting the image of a devout and harmless Catholic woman. But inside the prayer beads were hollow brass capsules each filled with finely sifted gold dust. She moved through checkpoints like a breeze through the mission walls. Rosa brokered with Mexican prospectors who were often barred from official gold sales or given unfair prices. She gave them fair deals, smuggled the gold to Los Angeles, and bought up small tracts of land, slowly rebuilding her family's fortune one hidden rosary at a time. These women were not outlaws in the usual sense. They weren't robbing banks or brandishing pistols. They were exploiting a loophole in a chaotic system, a moment in time when law enforcement was spread thin, infrastructure was lacking, and no one expected women to be the ones running gold out from under their noses. Still, it was risky business. Some were caught. A woman named Clara Dobson was stopped in Marysville by a new deputy who noticed her struggling to walk. Others simply disappeared. One woman, known only as the widow from Sonora, reportedly vanished en route Monterey with a shipment worth nearly $20,000. Her body was never found. Some whispered she was ambushed. Others said she started a new life under another name, perhaps in New Orleans or even Havana. Over time, as banks stabilized and transport security improved, the smuggling declined. Armored wagons began escorting gold shipments. Mining companies began offering safe deposit services, and women's roles, once marginal and unregulated, became more visible, more scrutinized. The world had changed, but those few years of lawless opportunity had already planted seeds. And they still wore corset, but now they were lined with silk instead of gold. Still, you have to wonder how much of early California's growth came not from the gold pulled from the ground. As the gold rush matured into a more settled economy, and the West turned toward statehood and structure, the golden era of female smuggling slowly came to an end. But not without leaving a quiet, glittering legacy behind. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, California's wildest mining camps were given way to towns, with paved roads, permanent banks, and federal oversight. The arrival of the telegraph, regular stagecoach service, and even the first armored gold shipments meant fewer opportunities for discreet, off-the-books transport. But for the women who had carved out lives and fortunes by moving gold under corsets and within hat linings, the transition brought something new: legitimacy. Many former smugglers transformed themselves into respectable business. Her small shop produced lace-edged bonnets and feathered caps for ladies in town. But those hats had a purpose beyond fashion. Joanna specialized in reinforced headwear, lined with flattened gold nuggets and hat pins that doubled as containers for fine dust. She no longer carried rosaries stuffed with gold, but she kept one by her bedside until a death reminder, perhaps, of the power she once held in her hands. They were passed down in fragments, remembered by bartenders, dressmakers, and the occasional granddaughter who found something strange sewn into the lining of an old trunk. Others suggested that a surprising percentage of gold exported through early ports came from private channels, many of them operated or facilitated by women whose names were never recorded. It was subtle, almost artistic. By the time she closed her shop in the 1870s, she'd invested in 3 boarding houses and quietly funded the county's first public library. The wealth they had quietly accumulated allowed them to purchase land, open businesses, and, in some cases, invest in the very infrastructure that once threatened to put them out of work. It was about turning lace into armor and corsets into It was about using every assumption that women were weak, naive, or incapable as cover for operations more disciplined and daring than most men could imagine. The smuggling years were like a tattoo hidden under fine gloves, proof of survival. In a time when women weren't supposed to have agency, much less money, they became shareholders in mining operations, stage lines, and early railroads. Women who built wealth, not with picks and pans, but with sewing kits, stovetop ingenuity, and an uncanny understanding of where power really lived. But in the shadows of that glittering tale is another one, quieter, more meticulous, and far more intricate. Her peach pies were famous and sometimes filled with more than just fruit. She once smuggled gold coins, baked into crusts, wrapped in muslin, and cleverly cut to look like slices ready for sale. Nellie never married. She lived in a modest cabin with 2 hound dogs and donated money to a local school for girls. When asked about her wealth, she'd only say, "Good crust makes a good life." Some even married, not for security, but for social position, choosing husbands who had no idea of the secret empire their wives had already built. But not all sought visibility. For some, remaining anonymous was part of the legacy. Take Joanna Jo McKinney, a woman who had been known across Nevada County as a millennial hat maker. Then there was Nellie Park, who ran a roadside pie stand just outside of and in San Francisco, an aging Rosa Villarreal watched from her upper balcony as the city transformed from muddy port to booming metropolis. Stories like these rarely made it into the newspapers or the official archives. Historians later debated how much gold truly moved its way through smuggling, female-run courier networks, and invisible hands. Some claimed the numbers were and maybe that was the point. Smuggling was never about glory. It was about power in a world that offered few paths to it. Today, the gold rush is still remembered through legends of reckless gamblers, bearded prospectors, and massive nuggets pulled from riverbed. It's the story of women who carried fortunes beneath their skirts, who turned needles and petticoats into tools of resistance, not in the ground, but in the hands of those clever enough to move it without being seen. And you have to wonder, how many fortunes today were founded on gold no one knew had ever been moved? You've probably heard the stories about how the West was won with steel rails and with explosions and surveying stakes hammered deep into the untamed wilderness. You've heard of the Chinese laborers who laid track across impossible mountains, and the Irish crews who worked through snowstorms and sabotage. But what you likely haven't heard about is the smell of burnt beans wafting over a cold prairie morning, or the clang of a dented ladle against a soup-blackened pot. Because before there was a railroad, there was breakfast. Inside, amid the steam and ash, frontier cooks, mostly men, but occasionally hardy women, fed armies of workers 3 times a day with whatever they could beg, buy, or barter from nearby settlements. They've been sleeping in tents or boxcars, their boots stiff from yesterday's mud. Before they can swing a hammer or lift a rail, they need fuel, calories, warmth, something to fill the aching hollow between ribs. And behind every mile of track stood a cookhouse. These weren't fancy kitchens or bustling restaurants. They were usually rough wooden sheds, large tents, or sometimes nothing more than canvas roofs draped over poles. Supplies had to be hauled in by wagon, often over rugged terrain. A stew might include 3 different cuts of meat, 2 of them barely recognizable. Dishes were rinsed more than they were scrubbed. Rats and flies were constant companions, especially in warmer months. A good cook kept the worst of it at bay by sheer willpower and threats. A great cook, however, had his own system, boiling rags at night, inspecting stores by lantern light, and training his assistants to toss anything that looked off. Sunday was the one day a cook might get fancy, but they kept the laborers alive, keeping morale just barely high enough to keep going. Well, there were stories of crews walking out en masse after 3 days of undercooked beans and spoiled pork. And when they didn't show up, when did illness or injury strike the cookhouse? Work stopped, tempers rose. Hunger made everything slower and more dangerous. A rail team can't dig a grade if they've got food poisoning, and no one can endure weeks on the edge of nowhere without a little warmth in their gut and a little salt on their plate. The stew might be thickened with flour, laced with a few dried herbs, and served with the last of the molasses. Coffee might even come with a splash of canned milk. On holidays, they might splurge on pie-dried apple, mostly with lard crusts and burned edges. Flour was extended with cornmeal. Coffee was reused grounds, boiled twice, then filtered through cloth to extract every last bitter drop. Greasepot Joe on the Central Pacific was said to have kept a cast-iron griddle in his wagon for over 10 years, seasoning it so well that even rancid bacon came out, tasting like heaven. Mama Ruth, a no-nonsense widow who cooked for Union Pacific crews, made cornbread so beloved that workers would barter extra shifts just for a second slice. When spices ran out, they leaned on salt and vinegar, simply left things plain and hot. Flour could arrive full of weevils. Milk curdled if it traveled too long. One dropped barrel could mean no sugar for a week. Cooks had to improvise constantly. Imagine it. You're standing on a wind-blown plain in Wyoming in 1868. The sun's not even up, but the men are. The rules were simple: eat fast, don't complain, and don't pick fights. Fights meant delays. Delays cost miles. Miles cost money. That's where the cookhouse comes in. Breakfast was early, loud, and greasy. The classic menu: beans, salt, pork, sometimes sourdough, wheat coffee boiled in kettles big enough to bathe in. If they were lucky, there might be eggs or potatoes. If they were very lucky, maybe a scrap of bacon that hadn't turned green. Meat was often salted, dried, or tinned anything that could survive weeks without spoiling in the brutal, shifting climates of the frontier. Meals were served cafeteria style: tin plates, wooden tables, and men seated shoulder to shoulder with the urgency of hunger. But cooking for 100, sometimes 300 men a day wasn't just exhausting, it was logistical warfare. One common strategy was stretching ingredients and hygiene. That was a fantasy. Clean water was rare. There were famous cooks on the line, known more by nickname than name. And then there was the matter of Sunday stew. In many camps, Sunday meant rest not for the cooks, but for the crews. Yet despite their importance, cooks were often overlooked. They weren't laying track, after all. They didn't hammer spikes or clear rock slides. The rail bosses knew this. That's why some cooks were paid almost as much as foremen. A good cook kept men from deserting. A bad one. You might wonder why these meals mattered so much. Why Foodine, all its bland, repetitive, greasy gourdies, a place in the story of how the West was built. But if you think about it, you realize a track layer can't swing a hammer if he's starving. So yes, while the history books remember the miles of track and the golden spike, the forgotten cookhouses kept the West moving. But how did these cooks endure the repetition, the pressure, and the filth? And why did so many stay in the job sometimes for decades long after the rails had reached the ocean? If you've ever wondered what it takes to keep 150 hungry men fed in the middle of nowhere, 7 days a week, through rain, snow, blistering heat, and every form of exhaustion known to man, the answer is simple: stubbornness. The frontier cook wasn't just a culinary laborer. He or sometimes she was a survivor, a makeshift doctor, a therapist, a referee, and an alchemist. Because what they had to do with what they were given often bordered on the impossible. Take the ingredients. For example, railroad cookhouses rarely had consistent supply chain. When deliveries were delayed or stolen, the cooks had to rely on whatever they had stored: barrels of sacks of beans, dried apples, and bacon that was more fat than meat. No meat. Use salted fish, even if it was half bone. The men grumbled until they realized the strange cakes stuck to their ribs longer than the usual thin ones. Most didn't finish cleaning up until after sundown, their hands raw from scrubbing pots with sand and ashes. After that, bean pancakes became a staple on Tuesdays. Potatoes were peeled by the bushel, onions sliced until eyes burned red. He stayed, boiled everything twice, started making meals with vinegar and boiled garlic, and refused to serve water that wasn't boiled to bubbling. Miraculously, his section of the crew suffered fewer deaths than the others. He never took credit, just wiped his hands on his apron and asked, who wanted more stew? Wood was chopped constantly. Fires had to be maintained through wind and snow, and ashes had to be cleared before they smothered the flames. Births they'd never see, wives they missed, brothers who hadn't written in months. She taught them to cook, clean, and manage supplies. They opened taverns, diners, or supply stores near the old track routes. Others followed the crews across states, their wagons loaded with kettles and grease-stained aprons. Ready to begin again? At least 3 of them went on to open restaurants after the railroad era passed. Their names are mostly lost, buried under miles of track and forgotten payroll ledgers. Historians recorded the rail bosses, the engineers, the labor disputes, and the tunnel collapses. She never married, never owned land, but left behind a lineage of cooks that fed thousands over the decades. The cook would nod, maybe grunt, maybe offer a second helping without saying a word. It was the closest many got to comfort when eggs were impossible to come by. Some cooks made mock eggs. Flour mixed with baking soda, vinegar, humor found its way in. Even here, some cooks gave nicknames to their equipment. Bertha the soup pot, Old Rusty the skillet, and the Beasts the bread oven. A few even painted faces or initials onto their cooking tools, claiming they worked better that way. Sometimes, local indigenous groups traded herbs or dried meats, and the cooks who treated them with respect often fared better than those who dismissed their knowledge. The crews expected their meals at specific times, no matter the weather, workload, or disasters unfolding around them. Breakfast had to be ready before first light. Lunch might be packed in tins and sent out to the line, usually cold biscuits and meat, if there was any left from breakfast. Dinner was hot, filling, and the most important meal of the day. If dinner was late, morale plummeted, and grease fried into patties that kind of resembled scrambled eggs if you squinted and tried not to taste them too hard. The flour could be damp, the lard could be rancid, and the coffee molded. Even the water might need to be boiled twice just to be drinkable. And still, they made meals. Cooks became master improvisers. No potatoes, use cornmeal. One cook on the Union Pacific line, known as Pickaxe Charlie, once made flapjacks with mashed pinto beans because flour was running low. It wasn't just about ingredients. The timing was everything. To keep up, cooks often started their day at 3 or 4 in the morning, chopping wood, firing up the stoves or campfires, and boiling gallons of water. Their assistants often young boys, older men no longer fit for rail work, or those injured on the job handled much of the hauling and peeling. These tasks didn't stop, even during disasters. When a cholera outbreak hit a Central Pacific camp in the Sierra Nevadas, the cook didn't flee. And when floods wiped out supply wagons, cooks turned to local wild game. Squirrel stew, rabbit roast, prairie dog pies. Still, it wasn't all grim. Many cookhouses developed rituals, jokes about Mystery Meat Mondays, contests for the biggest biscuit, or storytelling circles. While the beans simmered, cooks also served as informal counselors. Laborers far from home, lonely and battered, often confided in the cook during the rare quiet moments. In one rare case, a cook named Ruthie Palmer, working along the Kansas Pacific route, took in orphan boys who had been abandoned near the camps. Eventually, some cookhouses grew into permanent fixtures. When the rails moved on, some cooks stayed, and yet, for all their sweat and grit, few were remembered. But who wrote about the man who baked 200 biscuits a morning for 2 years straight? Or the woman who kept 90 men fed through a mountain winter with nothing but beans, salt, and boiled snow? Without them, the rails would never have reached the ocean. But how many stories of the West are missing simply because the hands behind the ladle never asked to be seen? When the last spikes were driven and the railroads connected coast to coast, photographers captured the moment. Men shaking hands over silver rails, workers lined up in neat rows, locomotives hissing proudly beside them. But just out of frame, hidden behind the smoke and ceremony, stood the cookhouses and the cooks quietly packing up their frying pans and coffee pots. The era of mobile railroad cookhouses was coming to a close. As railroads became permanent, so did their infrastructure. Fixed stations meant fixed restaurants, Harvey houses, dining cars, commissaries, places where meals were standardized, sanitized, and, for the first time, commercialized in a modern sense. Some stayed with the railroads, taking jobs in stationary kitchens. Others moved on to frontier towns where they applied their skills in boarding houses, inns, or mining camps. A few, like Griddle Sam Miller, opened their own restaurants, no frills. Just slabs of meat, thick gravy, and black coffee, the consistency of tar. They weren't chefs, but they didn't need to be. They fed people. That was enough. The gritty, makeshift cook shacks that once defined camp life became obsolete, left behind like the old campfires that smoldered in the wind. In one such diary found near an abandoned camp in Utah, A cook wrote, "I burned the stew and flavored it with foraged wild onions and soy," he begged from a passing trader. His entry ended simply. They ate it anyway, no complaints. The cooks of the railroads understood this. They might not have worn uniforms or given speeches, but they knew that no spike was driven on an empty stomach. Either they're freezing, or I've gotten better at this. But for the men and women who had worked those kitchens, the end of the mobile era was just another turn in the road. They could tell who was homesick from the way they lingered after meals. They often saw the first signs of illness, fevers, vomiting, sudden lethargy, and responded before any medic or supervisor. And though their stories didn't always make it into the official histories, they lived on in other ways. They took jobs in boomtown hotels, worked riverboats, or joined wagon trains. Heading even further west, they were drawn to motion, to the scent of coal smoke and fresh bread. They weren't heroes. They were doers. Cooks fed surveyors, mule drivers, visiting investors, and even the occasional government inspector. But the workers did, in their own way. A bottle was passed down the table, a carving etched into a table leg, a lopsided cake, baked by the crew themselves with pilfered flour and sugar, presented to Mama Joe with a toothless grin and a murmur. "We'd have starved without you." Meals were diplomacy, a stew well seasoned, a biscuit still warm, a cup of coffee strong enough to knock out a headache. These simple offerings often smoothed tensions and bought time. A full stomach made negotiations easier. In the recipes passed down through families, the lard-based pie crusts were perfected by necessity. When supplies didn't come, when pay was delayed, or when crews were mistreated, some cooks withheld food until the issue was resolved. Hunger, after all, was the ultimate leverage. The cowboy biscuits are still made in cast iron pans today. Salt if you have it. Lie if you don't. The jokes about campfire chili that echoed across decades. Some rail camps had cookbooks, though they were little more than scribbled notes passed between workers. Bean soak, one night boiled till they stop rattling. Flour thickens gravy, others left behind journals or letters yellowed with time. The boys built track in the snow today, another relic found in the effects of a Chinese laborer turned cook. Detailed how he steamed rice using a converted coal bucket tomorrow. Pancakes. If I find eggs, it is easy to forget that feeding a workforce of thousands is just as critical as leading one. They also knew things others didn't. They knew which workers were on the brink of breaking, not because of injury, but because they hadn't eaten properly in days. In many ways, they were the camp's pulse. They also had power, even if unspoken. Refusing to cook was a last resort, but it had happened, and they weren't just feeding laborers. When the railroad was finally declared complete in 1869 Golden Spike, flags, cameras few paused to thank the cooks. After the celebrations faded, many of those cooks simply kept cooking. And maybe that's why history overlooked them, because they never asked to be remembered. They just asked that no one leave hungry. Step off the stagecoach and take a deep breath, not too deep, though, because if you're visiting an American frontier town in the mid-1800s, what you're inhaling isn't fresh mountain air. To settlers, miners, and townsfolk scraping a living from the dust and mud of the expanding West, clean was a relative term. There were no plumbing systems, no centralized sanitation departments, and certainly no over-the-counter deodorants or mouthwashes. Cleanliness wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, or, more often, about endurance. It's a cocktail of horse, sweat, wood smoke, coal ash, damp wool, and the unmistakable tang of unwashed humanity. In most frontier settlements, water came from rivers, creeks, wells, or public barrels that weren't always well maintained. Drinking water might be hauled in wooden buckets, left exposed to dust and animal droppings, or stored in cisterns that doubled as mosquito breeding grounds. Some added mint or sage for flavor if they were fancy. Frontier dentists were often traveling barbers, blacksmiths, or general tinkerers with a pair of pliers and a strong stomach. An infected tooth meant extraction, no anesthesia, no sterilization, just a bottle of whiskey and a friend to hold you down. The powder was applied with a frayed stick, a cloth, or for those with access to City Zon, early bristle brush made from hog hair. There was no floss. If something got stuck between your teeth, you used a splinter of wood, a sewing needle, or left it there until it rotted out. Laundering took hours, sometimes days, and required heating vats of water, scrubbing on washboards, and hanging clothes to dry in dusty air where they might collect as much grime as they lost. Lice combs were sold in general stores, but most people just scratched. Indoor plumbing was virtually non-existent in most frontier areas until well into the 20th century. Smell management included placing dried herbs around the home, lighting candles, or simply opening the door and hoping for a breeze. Babies were swaddled in cloth. Diapers rarely changed as frequently as they should have been. These were mocked by some, appreciated by others. Traveling medicine shows hawked tonics and powders that claimed to cure bad breath, body odor, or female complaints, though most were alcohol mixed with sugar and herbs. Diaper rash was treated with lard or cold tea. Toys were shared, dropped in mud, chewed on, and rarely cleaned. Childhood illness spread rapidly, and hygiene played a major role in mortality rates. Flea powders made from dried herbs or tobacco ash were sprinkled in boots or bedding, but effectiveness varied wildly. One trick among cowboys was to soak underclothes in kerosene, hang them to dry, and wear them with fingers crossed that the pests would die before the wearer did. Boiling helped, but firewood was precious and time-consuming to gather, so many drank it as is. Hygiene in the frontier era was a matter of perspective. There were no disposable pads, no commercial tampons, and very little understanding of sanitation. Women often dealt with chronic infections, discomfort, and stigma, especially in remote communities where speaking about such things was taboo. Some people bathed with it, others drank it for courage before attempting to clean a boil, a lance, a blister. Straight razors were expensive, easily doled, and dangerous. Most men grew beards out of necessity. Women shaved only rarely, usually just ankles or armpits, and even then only in cities where fashion demanded it. And since germ theory hadn't caught on just yet, no one thought twice about using the same cloth to clean a wound and wipe a baby's face. Let's start with water, the cornerstone of hygiene, and ironically, one of the hardest things to keep clean: bathing. That was an ordeal, but more often, people simply layered on clothing and accepted body odor as part of daily life. Sweat was the scent of labor, and on the frontier, everyone stank, so no one noticed. If you were lucky enough to live near a river or spring, a quick dunk in the summer months might suffice. But in colder climates or drier areas, bathing was rare, maybe once a week, once a month, or in some harsh mining camps, once per season. A full bath meant hauling buckets of water, heating them over a fire or stove, and pouring them into a tin or wooden tub. Entire families might use the same bath water in succession, from eldest to youngest, with soap optional, depending on availability. Soap itself was handmade more often than not, a harsh, caustic substance created from animal fat and lye. It stung the eyes, dried the skin, and stripped oil so aggressively that people often avoided using it unless absolutely necessary. In many homes, laundry soap doubled as bath soap and dish soap. One bar did it all, even if it wasn't great at any of it. And what about oral hygiene? Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist. Most people used tooth powder's homemade blends of chalk, charcoal. Gums bled easily. Halitosis was so common that it went unremarked. Dental care, when it happened, was brutal. Speaking of whiskey, it was the cure-all for everything. Wound cleaner, painkiller, mouth rinse, hair tonic, breath freshener, shaving. For those who did it, was a luxury act. As for deodorant, the closest thing was perfume, usually made from crushed flowers or purchased from a traveling peddler. Clothing hygiene wasn't much better. People owned a few sets of clothes, and those were washed sparingly due to the sheer labor involved. Infestations, lice, fleas, and bedbugs were common. Outhouses and chamber pots were the norm. Privates were dug behind homes. But in cold weather, people often used buckets inside and dumped them later. Women faced additional hygiene challenges. Menstruation was managed with cloth rags, which had to be boiled and reused. Children fared no better. Still, there were efforts to improve things. Churches and women's groups occasionally hosted hygiene lectures, promoting hand washing, boiled drinking water, and fresh air. And yet, through all this, people survived. They adapted. They formed habits. They boiled what they could, scrubbed what they had to, and made do with what was available. But the question lingers, how did people feel about themselves in a world where being clean was nearly impossible? Did they long for a proper bath, or had they simply forgotten what clean used to mean? As the frontier expanded and settlements began to stabilize into something resembling towns and cities, the ideas around hygiene slowly started to shift, not just out of practicality, but necessity. Disease had a way of forcing awareness, even among the most rugged, dirt-caked residents of the West. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and typhoid fever didn't care how tough you were. They thrived in filth, and filth was everywhere. But in the absence of structured sanitation systems, people developed their own rules and rhythms for cleanliness, a patchwork of folk wisdom, trial and error, and community pressure. Let's start with the barbershop. It wasn't just a place to get a trim. It was often the de facto health center for men in many frontier towns. A skilled barber offered haircuts, beard trims, shaves, tooth pulling, minor wound cleaning, and if they had a bottle of carbolic acid or whiskey handy, amateur surgery. Hot water had to be hauled and heated, and early shampoos were more caustic than cleansing. Bathhouses offered a washtub, a small room, and a bucket of hot water for a price. It was considered bad form to enter a saloon without at least brushing off visible dirt. A teacher might not bathe daily, but she'd starch her collar, brush her hair until it's shut, and change her chemise more often than her students changed socks. Prospectors might go weeks without washing, but they'd comb their beards and splash creek water on their faces before heading into town. A clean handkerchief tucked in a pocket meant you hadn't completely given up. The water might be reused several times throughout the day, which meant that the earlier you arrived, the cleaner your bath. First dips, the best, became a common phrase, not just in water, but in every frontier transaction. The idea of miasma. Bad air was still popular, but germ theory was taking root, especially among wealthier townsfolk who could afford soap, tin bathtubs, and actual toothbrushes. They rarely worked as advertised, but they planted the seed. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was about status. And if you could afford a real bar of imported soap from Boston or New York, stamped and scented and wrapped in paper you didn't use it right away, you displayed it like jewelry. Or fine china. A clean house, a clean child, a clean shirt, these became badges of progress in an otherwise untamed land. Mothers were too busy, water was too precious, and boys in particular were expected to be dirty. It was a sign of vitality. Girls were taught to keep tidy at least their hands and faces, but full baths were rare luxuries. One letter from a young girl in Kansas Territory described her birthday bath as the nicest surprise because the water was hot and had lavender in it. One popular solution was a mixture of egg yolks, lemon juice, and rainwater, good for shine, terrible if left in the sun. Others rubbed in dry powders to soak up oils, then combed it out, a primitive version of dry shampoo. Sometimes they even hosted traveling lecturers who brought news of scientific cleanliness. A growing trend from the East that would eventually become public health policy. They'd sterilize razors with flame, not out of understanding germ theory, but because scorched steel seemed fresher. German settlers bathed more regularly, sometimes building small saunas out of logs and rocks. Ministers linked soap with morality. Clean bodies, they said, meant clean souls. Women organized Saturday wash days in larger towns, encouraging families to do laundry and bathe children on a regular schedule. It wasn't perfect, but it helped shift attitudes. Scandinavian homesteaders insisted on washing hands before meals and faces before church. These habits slowly trickled into frontier life, becoming aspirational norms among neighbors. Boiled chamomile for rashes, dried yarrow for sores, a poultice of lard and crushed garlic for infected wounds. For daily cleanliness, women might wipe their faces with rose water, wash their hair with lye soap or beer, and comb with boar bristle brushes to remove lice. If someone fainted barbers also dispensed hygiene advice, most of it half true but earnest. Rub vinegar on your feet to kill itch, chew pine needles for bad breath, and boil socks to keep fungus at bay. Women had their own networks for hygiene knowledge. In the absence of doctors, midwives, and herbalists, passed down centuries-old remedies. Hair washing was its own ordeal. Most people only did it every few weeks or even once a month. In mining camps and logging towns, bathing was sometimes a group activity not for pleasure, but for cost. Still, even among the roughest workers, a strange sort of etiquette emerged. Certain professions demanded more cleanliness than others. School teachers, hotel keepers, and saloon performers, especially women, were expected to maintain higher standards of appearance. Children were often left to fend for themselves when it came to hygiene. That said, some families took hygiene more seriously, often immigrants who brought with them old-world customs. Churches and women's clubs began to preach the gospel of cleanliness alongside salvation. Then came the influence of medicine. By the 1870s and 1880s, traveling doctors began giving public talks about sanitation, germs, and health. Some towns invested in community wells and privy inspections. Patent medicine salesmen were also everywhere, hawking deodorizing tinctures, breath powders, and disinfecting lotions made of camphor, mint, and ethanol. Still, most people remained deeply pragmatic. You washed what showed. You changed clothes when they stank. You cleaned wounds so they didn't fester. Because in the West, cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene. It was a symbol of hope, of civilization, of trying against the ODs. Build a life that wasn't just survivable, but maybe, one day, respectable. But with all this effort and change, did frontier folks ever get used to living clean? Or was a bit of dirt always part of feeling at home? By the end of the 19th century, the American frontier was changing. The days of wild camps and wandering prospectors were giving way to towns with sidewalks, schoolhouses, and city ordinances. It was being mass-produced in factories, stamped into uniform bars, and shipped west by rail. Tin containers and glass jars became common, with instructions printed right on the label. Some brands claimed to prevent tooth rot, freshen breath, and purify the mouth. Whether or not they worked, the idea of oral care as part of daily hygiene was slowly catching on. Brands like Pears and Ivory made their way into general stores, wrapped in decorative packaging and marketed with phrases like pure and cleaner than ever. For the first time, cleanliness wasn't just functional, it was fashionable. A tin tub in the kitchen remained a family bath for years to come. Sunday mornings for fresh clothes, even if they were worn and patched. A good scrubbing behind the ears, and a dab of perfume more often. Camphor or vinegar completed the transformation from farm laborer. Water was hauled in by hand, heated on wood-burning stoves, and reused until gray. A single bath might still serve a household father first, then eldest son, then the rest in order of social rank or smaller size, and community support systems that kept children clean and clothes mended, even in the poorest conditions. In wealthier homes, the introduction of water closets early, even if they often malfunctioned or froze in winter. They boiled their water, bathed frequently, and kept camps tidy. Clean water had to be hauled, wood chopped, fires lit, and clothes boiled. It was labor, it was time, and it was one more thing to do after a day spent plowing fields, tending livestock, or feeding children. The combs were wrapped in muslin to keep them clean. The tattered towels hung carefully, even when this difference was sometimes mocked or admired by nearby Americans, depending on who was watching. And with this creeping civility came a slow but steady revolution in cleanliness. Soap was no longer a rare commodity made at home by boiling fat and lie over a fire. When a child smiled wide after brushing with minty powder. When a woman put on a clean apron and said, "Well, now I feel like a person again." Scandinavian families took pride in scalded floors, scoured pots, and daily posters declared, "Clean children learn better, and a wash a day keeps disease away." Health inspectors were hired to assess privies and wells. Mothers were urged to scrub floors and boil linens. Hygiene became a tool of social pressure and control. Their practices clashed in, sometimes blended with the rougher norms of American settlers. Tooth powder, too evolved. Apothecaries and traveling salesmen sold pre-mixed blends with peppermint oil and ceremonial cleansing rituals, many of which were dismissed or ignored by Western newcomers who saw dirt where there was simply a different way of being. In larger frontier towns, Denver, Salt Lake City, Portland, you might find public bathhouses springing up, catering to miners, railroad men, and families who couldn't afford their own tubs. For a few cents, you could enjoy a private booth, a basin of hot water, and even a borrowed bar of soap. Some bathhouses offered aidance, a towel, a shave, a haircut, or a rub down with rose oil for an extra bit of frontier luxury. Hotels and boarding houses, especially those catering to the growing middle class, began installing shared washrooms with indoor plumbing. Women's hygiene products also began to evolve. While most women still managed menstruation with folded cloth and careful washing, the 1880s saw the arrival of mass-produced sanitary belts and absorbent pads, sold discreetly through catalogs, though crude by modern standards. These products offered relief and dignity to women who had spent generations improvising, but hygiene was still deeply tied to class, culture, and access. In smaller towns and isolated homesteads, change came slower. In these homes, hygiene was Saturday nights were for bathing, and as the West grew, so too did the tension between old habits and new standards. Immigrants arriving from Europe brought their own hygiene customs. Germans bathed regularly and built saunas. Italians used olive oil for skin and hair. Chinese railroad workers, often forced into segregated enclaves, were noted for their meticulous cleanliness. Black families in post-emancipation communities brought traditions rooted in resilience. Herbal washes, strong deodorizing soaps, and native tribes, despite being vilified in many settler accounts, often maintained sophisticated hygiene practices using natural soaps, river bathing. By the turn of the century, the U.S. government began pushing sanitation campaigns, especially in schools and immigrant communities. But for many frontier families, especially those still scratching out a living on homesteads and ranches, hygiene remained a hard balance. Still, they tried. You see it in the tin wash basins, dented but gleaming, hanging beside cabin doors, in the homemade tooth powders tucked into kitchen drawers, and in a moment's few but precious when someone took a bath, not because they had to, but because it felt good. Because on the frontier, where everything was hard-won, cleanliness wasn't just about sanitation, it was about dignity. And maybe that's why, even today, when we look back at those harsh, dusty days, we marvel not just at the railroads, the saloons, or the gun, but at the people who scrubbed their faces with cold water, brushed their teeth with salt and ash, and still managed to feel human. Picture this. It's the year 1860, and you're standing in a frontier town somewhere between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California. There's a crowd gathered near the general store, all eyes fixed on the horizon. Children shift impatiently. Shopkeepers pause and a sheriff leans quietly against a post rail with arms folded. No rider with saddlebags full of letters, newspapers, bank drafts, or desperate pleas scrawled in homesick hands. It's delivery day and everyone is waiting for the mail, with the familiar sound of galloping hooves never comes. There's no dust trail on the ridge, no flash of leather and sweat charging through town. The mail didn't come, and in 1860, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. But what's less remembered are the days when things didn't go as planned. The days when the system, miraculous though it was, faltered, and the consequences were far more severe than disappointment. Riders were told to go around sometimes, adding days to the route. Stations were supposed to be spaced every 10 to 15 miles, manned by stock tenders with fresh horses. But if a station was abandoned, burned, or raided, the chain broke. A rider arriving at a ruined station had few options: press on with a winded horse, or wait, hoping help would arrive. In spring, even swollen creeks became formidable obstacles, sweeping away horses and riders alike. Riders often crossed terrain where the seasons played by their own rules. In the Sierra Nevada mountains, snow could pile up faster than a horse could breathe. They could be swapped in seconds, but their security relied entirely on the rider's safety. Letters usually made it from Missouri to California in about 10 days. Astonishing for the time, but every missed delivery, every delay, every absence echoed louder because expectations were so high. The West needed the mail, and when it didn't come, people felt it. If a rider fell, so did the nation's secrets. The silence was heavy. After all, a town with no mail felt untethered. Was the government still functioning? Was war brewing? Had someone back home fallen ill? You wouldn't know. Not until the rider arrived. Riders pushed through blizzards so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. During the Pyramid Lake War of 1860, Paiute warriors attacked several Pony Express stations in retaliation for encroachment and violence by miners and ranchers. Others would try to send riders themselves, back east, forward west, anywhere that might provide news. Occasionally, newspapers printed what we think may be happening, vague, full of editorials and local gossip disguised as news. Riders were killed, horses stolen, stations destroyed, routes disrupted for weeks. If the wind howled too fiercely, or the snow swallowed the path entirely, a rider might take shelter in a cabin or vanish into the white forever. Letters piled up in station bunkhouse. Towns went dark, informationally speaking, with no word from the outside world. He posted it on the wall and offered a free whiskey to anyone who could disprove it. It took nearly 10 days before the real mail arrived and revealed the lie-by. Then, half the town had passed the fake news as gospel, and rumors, always hungry in the absence of fact, ran wild. Some fell asleep in the saddle and missed station turnoffs. Others lost the mail pouches during river crossings, or were thrown from horses in remote canyons. A few disappeared entirely, likely taken by bandits, or buried beneath landslides. The Pony Express, as we know it now, occupies a near-mythic space in American memory. Brave young riders, fleet horses, and relentless speed through dangerous terrain. You see, the Pony Express wasn't just about messages. It was about connection. In a time before telegraphs reached the western frontier, the mail was the only thread between isolated towns and the rest of the country. If you lived in Salt Lake City, Carson City, or a mining camp in Nevada, a letter from back east was everything. It brought news of births, deaths, war, drought, business, and hope. It reminded you that you hadn't been forgotten. So when the mail didn't come even once people noticed, and sometimes they panicked. But why didn't it come? Well, the causes were as varied as the trail itself. The most common culprit was, with flooded rivers also posed enormous threats. Makeshift bridges collapsed, fords turned to death traps, and horses refused to cross raging torrents. Then there were mechanical failures, not of machines, but of the fragile infrastructure the Express depended on. Speaking of raids, conflict was a constant threat. Many stretches of the Express Trail crossed lands belonging to Native American tribes who had no reason to welcome the U.S. mail service, especially when that service came with forts, soldiers, and settlers in its wake. In fact, during these periods, entire sections of the line were One story goes that during a week-long disruption, a saloon owner in Ruby Valley, desperate for news to attract customers, forged a letter from Washington claiming the Civil War had ended. Human error also played a role. Riders were mostly young boys in their late teens, chosen for their lightweight and toughness. But they were still human. The mailbags themselves were a marvel of design, small, lightweight leather mochilas, fitted to saddle horns with pouches at each corner. Despite all this, the Pony Express maintained a surprisingly good record. So what happened in the towns left waiting? Often, they waited longer. They gathered again the next day, and the next. Some would post lookouts. And the people, they stewed. They went back to work, digging ditches or sweeping porches, but with eyes constantly drifting toward the hills. If he arrived, and if he didn't, what then? Had the system failed, or had the land simply reminded everyone that it had the final say? It's easy now to romanticize the image of the Pony Express rider. A wiry young man, galloping at breakneck speed across rugged wilderness, with wind in his hair and a revolver at his hip. But for the riders themselves, those hired for $100 a month, promised fame and hardship in equal measure. The job was less about adventure and more about constant, calculated risk. And when the system failed, they often bore the blame. When the mail didn't come, it was the rider's face or lack thereof that townspeople remembered. Some would wait in frustrated silence. Others would jeer, muttering, "Bet the kid turned tail." Never made it past Fort Kearny. Not the company men in suits back in St. Joseph, nor the route managers in Salt Lake or Sacramento. But the truth was usually more complicated. There's the story of Robert Pony Bob Haslam, who in 1860 rode 120 miles straight through hostile territory with an arrow embedded in his shoulder just to deliver a batch of critical dispatches. He collapsed at the station but insisted that the mailbag be handed over first. A rider might be stranded by illness, another might be wounded, hiding from bandits, or caught in a flash flood, clutching a saddlebag while trying to stay above water. Riders were told to defend the mochila with their lives. Two families waiting for word from loved ones, or merchants awaiting contracts or payments. It was for them. The frontier wasn't romantic. It was silent, opaque, and unforgiving. But how much could a 17-year-old do when outnumbered by a raiding party, or ambushed by outlaws who knew exactly when the mail would be passing through? Riders were expected to travel about 75 to 100 miles per shift, switching horses every 10 to 15 miles. If even one of those stations lacked a fresh mount because of disease, theft, or poor, planning it could delay the entire route. The animal was lathered in sweat, eyes wild. The station man halted it, searched the road behind no rider in sight. He assumed an accident or attack and immediately saddled a fresh mount to carry on the delivery himself. Horses, too, were pushed to their limits. They were selected for speed, not stamina, and many collapsed. Newspapers went blank for days at a time, their editors forced to invent filler copy or print old sermons from 6 months prior. In the vacuum of information, people imagined the worst: war, death, betrayal. Trust in a system weakened. When they did, the rider had two options: walk or wait. Neither one guaranteed the mail would arrive on time. Still, others pressed on, knowing every minute of delay was another thread fraying between East and West. Company policy dictated that mail be carried at all costs. They took their letters, read their news, and went back to their lives. Some riders did manage heroic escapes. He'd been thrown during a night storm and crawled to shelter, more concerned about the fate of the mailbag than his survival. These riders worked blind, following hoofprints, broken branches, and guesswork. Sometimes, they found the missing rider, injured, hungry, still clutching the reins. Sometimes they found only his horse, grazing with an empty saddle. Riders who survived often faded into obscurity, carrying scars and stories that few wanted to hear once the telegraph arrived and rendered the express obsolete. And for the people of the frontier, from telegraph clerks to tavern owners, miners to school teachers, the arrival of that saddlebag was a moment of wonder, even reverence. And sometimes, they found nothing at all. Others weren't so lucky. Stations burned. Saddles went missing. A few pouches of Melich's worth thousands in value, and often carrying delicate, irreplaceable letters simply disappeared into the frontier. And still, the express tried to recover. When a rider failed to arrive on schedule, a nearby station might send out a scouter, secondary rider, or relay man to trace the route backward. In those cases, mail was officially marked lost en route, a vague term that concealed the human cost behind missing correspondence. The express also relied heavily on timing, and then there were the horses that ran. But without a rider, one harrowing tale tells of a station keeper near the Ruby Mountains spotting a lone horse charging toward him. Mashila still attached. The missing rider was found days later, dazed but alive, in a gulch with a broken leg. And what was the compensation for this level of risk? Aside from the monthly pay generous for the time, there was little. No pensions, no medical care, no commendations for acts of bravery. Still, despite all the breakdowns and misfires, the Pony Express earned a reputation for reliability. Letters did arrive, messages were delivered, but those moments of failure, when did the mail not come? They left deep marks. Businesses failed because contracts never arrived. Marriages are strained under silence. Soldiers at distant forts lost contact with home. And yet, perhaps more telling is what didn't happen. Towns didn't riot. People didn't abandon their posts. The frontier grumbled, sighed, and kept going, because they knew, on some level, that everything out, here every road, every handshake, every hope was built on the possibility of failure, and on the grit to try again anyway. So when the rider did finally arrive, covered in dust, clothes torn, perhaps limping, but alive, the town gathered again, not in anger, but in something resembling awe. But one question always lingered. What if, next time, he didn't come at all? When the Pony Express was officially shut down in October of 1861, just 18 months after it had begun, there was no parade, no national tribute, and no gold watch for the boys who had risked their lives crossing a continent. And the riders who galloped through hail and heat the end felt personal. The overland telegraph had been completed, making the handwritten letter on horseback nearly obsolete. And that, in a strange way, hurt more than all the misfires that came before. In a matter of days, the West was suddenly connected to the East by a humming wire, not a sweating horse. But for the people who had lived by the rhythm of the express, the townsfolk who gathered anxiously near station doors, the clerks who logged every arrival, it was emotional. The mail didn't come because the mail wasn't needed anymore. Still, the legacy of the failed deliveries lingered, because for every triumphant arrival remembered in song or story, there were dozens of near misses, delays, and disappearances that shaped the frontier's relationship with communication and with trust. Some riders became others took up work with freight companies, or joined the Union Army as scouts and messengers. It was identity, proof you existed in someone's thoughts, because on the frontier, hope often traveled faster than fear. Evidence of connection, a lifeline made of words, a kind of phantom network, stitched together not by infrastructure, but by absence. A few open taverns, or trading posts, and were known locally by the stories they told, often beginning with, "Back when I rode for the express." But the deeper impact of those disrupted deliveries wasn't economic or military. The ones that remind us that progress doesn't happen without risk, that even systems built on precision and speed are at the mercy of storms, terrain, and time. Imagine waiting 6 weeks for a letter from your wife in Ohio and it never arrives. Imagine sending money to your son working a claim in Nevada, only to learn it vanished with a rider in the Utah desert. Imagine receiving a letter dated months ago, telling you of your father Esteth and knowing you could have written him back had you only known sooner. The mail wasn't just paper and ink. So when the system faltered, when the horse didn't arrive, or the station was empty, or the mailbag was found in a ravine weeks later, sun-bleached and half-torn knit, cut deep. And yet, the people kept writing, even knowing the risks. They sent letters, carefully folded sheets of paper, sealed in wax, or tucked in oilskin pouches, entrusted to strangers on horseback. That hope fueled the Pony Express, even on its worst days. Even when the mail didn't come, and years later, when the Express had passed into legend, the memory of those lost letters remained in old trunks and attics. in courthouse archives, and in stories told beside campfires. It's said that in certain Nevada ghost towns, you can still find old mailboxes nailed to leaning porch posts, waiting for letters that never arrived. It's said that some writers were buried with their mochilas, their contents long forgotten, but their role never dismissed. And it is said that the greatest failure of the Pony Express today's the mail didn't take more. Also its most human moments. Today, we tap messages across the globe in seconds. But there was a time not so long ago when every letter carried in a leather pouch was a leap of faith, and when it didn't arrive, the silence spoke louder than any reply. The phrase ladies' night might conjure up images of free drinks and modern cocktails, but in the rough saloons of the 19th century American West, the term meant something very different, and often something far less glamorous. Because in the frontier towns of Colorado, Montana, and the Dakota Territory, ladies' night wasn't about celebration. It was about strategy. It was a carefully orchestrated event, staged by saloon owners, desperate to draw in customers by creating the illusion of respectability, entertainment, and perhaps even romance in places better. Known for brawls, tobacco spit, and the heavy stink of unwashed boots. So what was served at one of these ladies' nights? Well, that depends on where you went and what kind of lady you were. Mining camps were often 90% male, with female residents being a mix of laundresses, widows, boarding house owners, school teachers, saloon workers, and sex workers. But seated at tables, sipping drinks, playing piano, gave their establishment a kind of polish. It wasn't just a whiskey den anymore. It was entertainment. It was lively. It was perhaps even refined. Because of this gender imbalance, women carried a peculiar kind of social weight. Their presence could civilize a space, or scandalize it, depending on who was watching. Let's start with the basics. In many boom towns, during the 1870s and 1880s, women were a minority. Saloons, especially the more ambitious ones, quickly realized that having women inside, not just behind the bar, so they leaned on what they had. Crackers, pickled eggs, preserved peaches from a tin. In larger towns, saloons might host a ladies' cotillion, complete with dancing and seating arrangements. Some of the women in attendance were hired guests, actresses, musicians, or sex workers, dressed modestly to play the part of respectable ladies. They might sit together in a corner booth, fanning themselves nervously and sipping lemonade, while casting wary glances at the more flirtatious attendees. For them, this wasn't leisure. It was a social experiment, a way to observe, to be seen, perhaps to test the changing boundaries of what was acceptable. Their job was to laugh at the jokes, sway to the music, and order drinks to keep the till ringing. Many used aliases and slipped out the back when things got too rowdy. For some, especially single women working long hours in laundries, boarding houses, or seamstress shops, it was one of the few chances to socialize, hear music, and feel part of the community. They dressed in their best, powdered their faces, and hoped for an evening without insults. Others posted signs like, "After all, in towns with far more men than women, every dance, every glance, every seat at the table held potential." Gentlemen were told to mind their manners. No spitting, no swearing, and shirts must be tucked in. For one night, at least on the surface, the rules changed. A single word could spark a fistfight. Despite the pretense of civility, the underlying energy of a frontier saloon didn't vanish. It simmered just beneath the surface. Some got creative and offered dainty plates of cheese, cubes, and dried fruit, or even sugar cookies dusted with nutmeg. But the goal wasn't nutrition, it was the atmosphere. In others, only during holidays, paydays, or whenever business was slow, advertisements painted on saloon windows or posted on boards might read. That's where ladies' night came in. The concept wasn't standardized. In some towns, it was held weekly. Ladies, drink free. Saturday from sundown, music and mocktails for the fairer. Sect free, pastries, and punch for the gentle daughters of Deadwood. A lady might receive a single complimentary cup, usually a watered-down cordial or punch served in chipped glassware. The rest came at full price. More importantly, the food, when offered, was often limited to simple fare. Sponge cake made with old eggs, sandwiches with stringy ham, or, in some fancier places, paper-thin slices of cucumber on stale bread. What activated these ladies, however, was mixed. For one thing, the drinks were often far from free. Saloon keepers weren't chefs. Their kitchens, if they had one, were usually used for boiling beans and reheating stew. If there was entertainment, it came in the form of a pianist playing parlor music, a recitation of romantic poetry by a drunk miner, or the occasional traveling magician. But behind the scenes, these events were still business. Others, the actual wives and daughters of local men, attended cautiously, if at all. It's important to note that ladies' night wasn't always safe. Saloon floors were sticky with beer. The air was thick with smoke and tension. To protect the women, or at least to keep the peace, some saloons hired temporary floor men or stationed deputies near the door. Gentlemen will treat our lady guests with courtesy, or be ejected without refund. How effective these warnings were depended entirely on the saloon keeper's willingness to follow through. Interestingly, not all women hated these events. Others came with plans. A good ladies' night might offer a chance to find work, make a connection, or secure a suitor. And some came simply to watch, to observe the absurd theater of toughened miners trying to be cool, of bartenders wearing boaties over sweat-stained shirts, of gamblers offering poems instead of poker chips. But beneath all the noise and punch bowls was a more subtle truth. Was ladies' night a gesture of respect, or just another? As the lamps flickered low and music filtered from upright pianos that were perpetually a half note out of tune, ladies' night began to unfold across dozens of frontier towns with a curious blend of formality and farce. Beneath the clinking glasses and forced pleasantries, everyone, women and men, alike understood that the night wasn't really about the ladies. It was about money. Saloon owners had discovered that the mere presence of women changed the behavior and spending habits of their male patrons. If there was a carpet, it got beaten with a broom until most of the dust surrendered. Candles were replaced with oil lamps, and sometimes fragrant herbs, like mint or lavender, were hung near windows to mask the ever-present scent of beer and tobacco. A man might sip one beer on a quiet Tuesday, but put him in a room with a few well-dressed women, and suddenly he's ordering whiskey for the table, lighting cigars, and tipping the pianist. Ladies' night was, in essence, an early frontier form of marketing optics. First, authenticity. Second, instead of poker chips and shot glasses, one might find lace runners or at least a clean rag laid across the boards. Some saloons arranged mismatched china or provided tin cups wrapped in paper napkins. A few even placed menu cards at the bar, offering options like butt to keep the illusion alive. The saloons had to play the part. They scrubbed their floors with vinegar and lye the morning of the event. The tables were set differently. To ladies' menu, the pianist was usually a jack of all tunes, shifting from ragtime to waltz depending on the mood. In some towns, fiddle players or harmonica duos were hired just for the night. They performed ballads, slow dances, or if the women were specially bold, a polka or two. The dance floor, if it existed, was a cleared space between tables, its boards worn smooth by boots and hope. The drinks, too, were designed for gentler, palate-sweetened punches, fruit wines, and even cream liquor. There was mostly milk, nutmeg, and a whisper of brandy, a twist of lemon peel, a few preserved cherries, or an edible flower atop a sweet. Cordial could go a long way in impressing the guests and earning tips. These women weren't bartenders in the modern sense, but they were performers, blending flirtation with flair. Lemon, cordial complimentary. Respectable wives and saloon girls mingled at the same table, united in a temporary truce of femininity and spectacle. For a few hours, the rigid frontier hierarchy loosened. They resented being lured in with free offerings only to find themselves surrounded by drunk men playing at civility. They leafleted outside saloons, warning that tea with whiskey is still whiskey, and urging women to stay home. A few events were even disrupted by activists, hurling eggs or shouting scripture through open windows. Others worried about appearances after all. What would the preacher's wife say if she saw you dancing with the stable boy? They were unpredictable, imperfect, and at times awkward. Yet they offered something rare on the frontier. An evening set aside for women to be seen, heard, and momentarily catered to. Even if the motives were economic, everyone was pretending something to be wealthier, kinder, more cultured, or less lonely. Sometimes they were traveling actresses stranded between towns, working for a place to sleep and a cut of the door. Dandelion. But many sought something else. Ladies' night was a gossip mill. Deals were hinted at, partnerships proposed, scandals whispered. The best eavesdropping spot was always the corner booth, where women could sip lemon cordial and quietly chart the shifting cherry. Most of the crowd didn't understand the words, but they were mesmerized by her voice and the shimmer of her earrings. She vanished the next morning, but her name lived on in saloon whispers for years. Ginger cake with molasses, glaze 5, pickled eggs 1, each salted biscuits with clove butter. These offerings weren't luxurious, but they were a far cry from the usual frontier fare of hardtack and beef stew. Saloon keepers, with an eye for novelty, brought in mocktail mixers, local girls who specialized in crafting decorative drinks. Music was essential. A ladies' night without it felt hollow. But the most curious part of ladies' night wasn't the refreshments or the decor. It was the shifting social contract. For one night, the rules changed door, at least bent. A school marm might accept a dance from a blacksmith. A widowed seamstress might sit punch beside a gambler. Some women came with motives. A few were looking for husbands, of course. And then there were the performers' women, who weren't just there to mingle, but to entertain. They might sing, play guitar, or recite poetry. Sometimes they were local girls with genuine talent. One account from Laramie describes a woman known only as Miss V, who arrived wearing a green velvet gown and performed a dramatic monologue from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Not everyone was charmed by the event. Some women bristled at the performative nature of ladies' night. In some towns, ladies' night drew protests from temperance activists who saw it as a gateway to moral decline. But despite the friction, or perhaps because of it, ladies' nights persisted, and you can't help but wonder, did any of these nights lead to something lasting? A friendship, a business deal, a quiet rebellion, or were they just flickers of performance, disappearing with the morning sun and the return of spit on the floorboards? As the lamps dimmed and the pianists closed their final chords with a yawn and a cracked knuckle, ladies' night in the Frontier Saloon wound down the same way it had begun, with a mingling of possibility and pretense. Others lingered, pressed into laughter-filled corners, perched on bar stools that had once only welcomed elbows and in those quiet, late hours, the spell of civility wore thin, revealing the event for what it truly was. Not a celebration, but a carefully balanced performance, a tightrope between decorum and desire. The punch bowls sat nearly empty, their sugary bottoms settled with orange peel and cherry stems. The salted biscuits had gone dry, and someone's half-eaten ginger cake still rested on a tin plate, untouched since the second waltz. The chance to step into the public sphere without apology, to be present in a space historically claimed by men. Hands reached for one another during dances with surprising care. Laughter real and force bounced between the walls, alongside the clink of glass and the scratch of chair legs on floorboards. A boarding arrangement was made between two widows who'd shared a booth. They picked up on which merchants were planning to sell, which ranchers were in debt, which travelers were reliable, and which were not. The saloon, for all its bluster, served as an unofficial clearinghouse of information. Ladies' night turned women into silent strategists, a marriage proposal, or at least a courtship born from one surprisingly well-executed poll. Sometimes tempers flared, old rivalries, or someone forgot the no swearing rule and found himself bodily tossed into the street. It was understood. This space belonged to the ladies at least for now. And occasionally, It was the women themselves who disrupted the night, turning sharp tongues against one another, trading insults or icy stares over old grudges or new affections. The lace table runners were folded and stored. The ladies' menu was chalked off the board, and the tin cups were replaced by thick-bottomed mugs. The floors would be sticky again. The pianist would return to fast ragtime, and the spell would be broken. Maybe it was about carving out space in a world that didn't offer much of it, about claiming even just for an awara place at the table, where stories were traded and futures were quietly written, to wear your nicest dress, speak your mind a little louder, and be regarded, if only briefly, as someone whose company added value. A space where women weren't just guests in a saloon. Some women left early, linking arms and stepping carefully across muddy plank sidewalks in borrowed boots. These were modest side rooms, outfitted with curtains, oil paintings, and fainting couches. They smelled of soap and cigar smoke. In these spaces, women could gather more regularly to read, to chat, or to drink tea infused with just enough something extra to dull the edge of the week. And yet, for many of the women who attended, the evening was memorable, even meaningful. In towns where social outlets were few and entertainment scarcer still, Ladies' Night offered something more valuable than free drinks: visibility. Of course, there were missteps. Not every event went smoothly. Sometimes, a drunken miner, too far gone to respect the occasion, would stumble onto the dance floor and demand a kiss. One recorded incident from Silver City, Idaho, in 1885 tells of a lady's cotillion gone spectacularly wrong. A saloon owner, eager to impress, brought in crates of canned fruit and imported brandy, advertising the event as an evening of refinement and fragrance. He even hired a violinist. But halfway through the night, a piano girl named Lydia accused a local boarding house matron of spiking her punch with kerosene. The argument escalated into a shouting match that ended with overturned tables, a broken lamp, and two women wrestling in the alley behind the bar. The sheriff was called. The event was never held again, but more often than not, the nights passed in a curious calm. People watched their words. Smiles were practiced. Some women did find opportunity. Ladies' nights occasionally birthed something lasting: a new seamstress shop, backed by a saloon keeper who'd once laughed at the idea. And behind the curtain of flirtation and formality, women often learned more about the town's pulse than the men realized. As the events became more common and expected, some towns even began building separate parlors within their saloons to cater to female guests. These parlors also birthed a strange kind of respect. Men, when entering them, were expected to remove their hats. Voices were kept low. Arguments paused at the doorway, and yet it was temporary. By morning, the saloon would be back to its usual self. The traces remained in the stories told days later, half true, half teasing, in the smear of rouge on a whiskey glass, in the boot prints of two women walking home under starlight, laughing at something no one else would ever understand. Because maybe Ladies' Night wasn't about elegance or equality, and maybe, as the frontier marched toward railroads, statehood, and eventual modernity, those flickering nights with their weak punch and crumbly cake were the first tentative steps toward a louder presence. But citizens in a town